so beset by technology. I'm just going to do this old school to the point that I'm going to kind of read and have a conversation with you all today rather than some big dog and pony show. So the title of my talk is Remaining Relevant, Reviving Revenue. Good afternoon, Lake County historians and heritage supporters. It is a distinct honor to be here as your guest and speaker on this special Thanksgiving celebration dinner. It is my hope that your takeaways today will be number one, encouragement, number two, perhaps some new insight, number three, a willingness to revisit certain nonprofit truths, and finally, what's next? In the nearly 4 decades I have been been involved in heritage as a volunteer, as a museum professional, board member, board president, and concerned spectator, I have seen the decline in heritage organizations. This is a serious decline in memberships, it's a decline in event participation, fundraising, an increase in apathy, and then the demographic realities that have all to some degree or another led to the demise of historical societies, museums, service organizations, and generally many nonprofits, especially those involved in heritage. Gee, Clark, you might say, tell us something we don't know. So I will tell you something that is actually pretty obvious in this room. The average donor, she is 69 years old, and her peak giving was age 65. As a boomer, she stepped into the shoes of the builders, the joiners, but they are fast leaving us. The boomers want value for their philanthropy. They desire recognition, and they get it out of generosity and for a cause that is dear to them and their social circle. They recognize their community and they want to better it. I think we all can agree with that. The echoes of their parents' voices who survived the Great Depression, they hear almost subconsciously. It is better to give than to receive. Their sense of community service is highly developed. However, we aren't as young as we used to be. Generation X and Y, they are doing what I was doing in my 20s through 40s, and probably all of you were as well. Raising a family, paying a mortgage, and trying to keep body and soul together. Generation X and Y aren't typically joiners. They are passionate about causes that speak to them, such as social justice and economic equality. Like millennials, they seek experience and they are willing to pay for it. Wine, beer, and food festivals, as well as street parties, sporting events, and concerts, all interesting. Our fundraising efforts need to target all these groups actively and continually with programming, exhibits, and events which connect with their interests and passions. So I'll talk a little bit about reviving revenue, which sounds like since you guys have a money bag, it's all really important to us. We all recognize the reality that catastrophic wildfires and weather extremes that are with us in the foreseeable future. We can choose to be Eeyore from Winnie the Pooh. It's always something, or I never get my hopes up, so I never get let down. While I will freely admit I have a cynical side, I also operate on the positive side. I don't like no for an answer. Just ask my bosses, Lars Ewing and Katie Galvani. I just don't like no. That's not a me thing. I like to consider no as a temporary roadblock. I want to know the whys and wherefores of no, because if I know the whys and wherefores of no, well, we don't have enough funds, man, woman, power, time, etc. Well, those are all resources that, how do we figure out our way around that? How do we work smarter and not harder? So when I hear no, The little voice in my head says, but if we had more money, resources, people, and so forth, that to me is a temporary no. So I'm not a big fan of, well, we can't do it or it's happened this way forever. We can. There is a lot of money out there. It's asking the right people. Some of you have heard me talk before. The number one reason people don't give to nonprofits, museums, whatever it happens to be, the local symphonic orchestra, nobody asked me. And so when you do ask somebody, you have to take a no if they give you a no, not personally. They're just not necessarily interested in your organization. They may be interested later on. So back to the bane of our existence, the wildfires. We can't make them go away. However, we can do our part to fireproof our heritage. What can each of our organizations do individually and more to our focus today collectively to fireproof Lake County's rich and unique history? We all care deeply, passionately, but that is not enough. To properly and effectively steward our heritage, it requires resources. We all recognize that undeniable fact. We are all well aware of our shrinking memberships, engagements, events, door attendance, and so on. So how do we fireproof our historical assets, our collections, our magnificent buildings? Physically, it looks like fire suppression. Buildings and Grounds does a magnificent job with the museums of Lake County, Gibson Museum, the Courthouse Museum, and Lower Lake Schoolhouse in keeping the area cleaned up and removing fuel, getting rid of the weeds and the overgrowth and so forth. We're lucky in the Courthouse Museum, thanks to the Friends of the Lake County Historical Museum, that 15 odd years ago, they put in a sprinkler system. So that's good. I'd like to see a sprinkler system at the Lower Lake Schoolhouse, but it would be a rooftop sprinkler system because it actually makes more sense for that space and the danger that that space has, in addition to the seismic retrofit. I can toss out a couple of trigger words just for fun here, like elevators and bats. And yeah, anybody who's been around our museums, and I see Linda over there, she knows what elevators and bats mean. So there's no shortage of physical improvements needed in our 147-year-old courthouse. So Boris already did it, but I will remind you, this afternoon we are serving cake 4 to 7. We have an open house at the Courthouse Museum celebrating the 40th year of the courthouse as a museum. And put it on your calendar, save the date. The 150th anniversary of the courthouse is coming up in 2021. So bear that in mind. So now to the big idea. How do we financially fireproof all of our museums and cultural facilities? We all know the county simply does not have the revenue currently to hire more people and make much needed improvements to our physical plant. For better or worse, that is incumbent on us as supporters, proponents, and yes, evangelists for our heritage. I wish I could stand up here and wave a magic wand or point to a blackboard and say, here's the magic formula to solve this critical shortfall. I don't have that. However, based on many conversations over the last couple of decades with peers, boards, communities, and donors, there are actions we can take. Quick raise of hands. How many of you are members of more than one history-related nonprofit in Lake County? So roughly about 25%. Thank you for that. How many of you are members of non-history related nonprofits? So you're the joiners, you're the builders. again, thank you for your efforts in the past. But don't hang up that philanthropic retirement jacket yet, because there's still work to do. We all should recognize we're all in the same pond, if not the same boat. Would it not make sense to all get into one figurative boat so we can all pull on the oars together in the same direction, that we can all bail water, set sails for the revenue breeze we all so desperately need? We have a heritage network that comes together briefly for the fair. In my opinion, we should consider getting together more frequently and combining strengths and messaging to ensure the long-term survival of our museums and cultural centers. A rising tide does raise all boats. Currently, one of the things we're doing in the museums of Lake County, we're engaging with the local Pomo tribes to improve our interpretation at each of our museums, as well as the statue project in Museum Park in downtown Lakeport. So let's all continue to look for non-traditional partners. There is more money out there. Remember, I don't like no. And if it's not in the quantities necessary in Lake County, then let's look outside the county in the form of grants and so forth. The biggest challenge I see with grants is, number one, a lot of the grants need a match. And then number two, it's simply the time to write the grant. I've written a couple of grants, and they were pretty good money, $375,000 and $500,000. And the first one took 80 to 120 hours. Well, that's a significant time resource. And so, but there's also, any grant is part art, part science, and at the end of the day, rolling the dice. We've been fortunate, recently, a grant we put out, we had an A-team involved with it. Kathy Ferguson did a great job. I was a little bit, when the county told me, we have a grant writer who's never written a grant. I'm like, okay, this is going to be fun. But Kathy took to it literally like a duck to water. And so between her and Katie and myself, and a name I'm sure you all know, Karen McDougall, we put together a compelling grant package. So I think we're going to get that federal grant. The challenge is we need a lot more money for the match. The larger the match, the better artist we can hire through an RFP process, through the county. So if you haven't seen the website, I'll just throw it out there, lcpomostatue.com. We've got into the 21st century. We can take cash, check, money order, or you can go to the website and take that deduction. I would invite the leadership of all the historical societies to meet and consider how we, as the Heritage Network, can partner to ensure not simply the survival of our museums and organizations, but also the dawn of a new age of enlightenment for our beloved county and communities. I believe we have a room here full of doers and wisdom. Thank you very much for your gracious hospitality, and I would be happy to entertain any questions time permitting.